In this video, I'll show you a bunch of refactoring techniques that are going to significantly boost your productivity once you start applying them daily. Alongside, I'm going to show you a bunch of tips that are super handy as well. Let's go. The first tip I'm going to talk about is whenever you want to run some code, instead of creating new files and creating main functions, you can always add a new test somewhere, and then you can use that test as a runnable to run particular code you want to try out. On top of that, keep in mind you can always use the run test function if you need to make calls to suspending functions as well. Now, let's assume that I need to write a function that will be processing some messages. Instead of creating that function first, I can write here how would I want to call that function. And then I would let Android Studio generate that function for me. In this case, I would like to call process messages. And because this function doesn't exist, I can let Android Studio generate that for me. Just hitting Alt Enter will open this little pop-up, and then just hitting enter once again will generate that function for me. Let's assume that inside this function I have a logging and then processing of particular message. Once again, I don't have these functions and I can let Android Studio generate them for me. Let's put some simple implementation inside these functions. Now, looking into the log function, we notice that it takes in a string argument that is named string, and that's not the best name we can apply. When it comes to changing it, what I'm seeing over and over again people do is manually changing this name here to message, and then going down there and again calling message. Now, that is a lot of manual work, and if we assume that this message is being used in multiple places inside this function, we're gonna have a way harder time manually changing the name. Instead, we could use the rename refactoring. So when we put the cursor anywhere around a variable name, we can hit Shift F6, or we could open the refactor this window, and the first option here is rename. Obviously, it's gonna be even better if you master the shortcuts, because then you don't have to go through the refactoring menu, and then you can just hit a shortcut, in this case Shift F6, that will open the refactoring and then just apply the new name. So mastering the shortcuts is amazing, but before you do that, you can simply use one shortcut to open the refactoring menu, like refactor this, and then choose a refactoring from there. Also, if you start typing, for example, rename, it will filter out the available ones. And in that sense, you're still better to use this refactoring menu compared to manually changing the name. The next refactoring I want to talk about is here we are calling two functions with the very same argument. And while this might not be a problem here in this code, I keep seeing this kind of duplication, especially in compose code and in testing code. And obviously we can do better. We can extract this into a local variable or a parameter. So I'm gonna show you both refactoring. If you're working with compose, you know that oftentimes it happens that you know how to do something, but you don't remember exactly the syntax or exactly what was the construction to use. Because of that, I've paired up with Martin Moscala and we created comprehensive cheat sheets that are super helpful when using with compose, so you can use them hand in hand with your Android Studio so that you can quickly find specific things that you need while working with compose. Find a link below this video and go grab them quickly. If you want to extract a variable, again we can use the refactoring menu and we can say introduce variable, or we can use the shortcut Command Alt V, which stands for variable. And then it's gonna ask us whether we want to replace this or both occurrences. And then by selecting both, it's gonna just say message by default, but we can rename it as well. We can say string or message, anything that we like, and then it replaces. On the flip side, to extracting, there is inlining. So sometimes we don't want this message or this argument to be extracted like this, but we want that to be inline. Again, the refactoring is called inline, and depending on the context, it would either inline a property or maybe a class, maybe a function, depending on what you have. You can inline any of those code constructs depending on what you are doing. So if I hit this, it is going to inline the property to the functions directly as it was before. And just as I said, if I want to inline a function, let's say this log is a function. If I go to that function, I just have to position the cursor on the name of the function and then hit the command. And then it is going to ask me whether I'm sure if I want to inline the references and remove the function. If I hit enter, it is going to take whatever was in the function and inline it here inside, which is what happened in this case. I'm gonna undo that, and I'm also going to undo the inlining of the message. Now I'm gonna show you how we can extract parameter. Keep in mind that extracting parameter works for both functions and classes. So we can extract parameter as a constructor argument, for example, directly. Again, I'm gonna put the cursor in front of the thing that I want to extract, or I can just select it. And then either I'm gonna hit the keyboard shortcut or again use the refactoring menu. Maybe a tip that will help you remember the extracting refactoring is that on Mac it is always Command Option, and then depends on the letter that you're gonna hit, it's gonna extract different things. So M stands for method or a function in Kotlin, P stands for parameter, F stands for field, V stands for variable. And also if I open the refactoring menu, you can see that just the letter at the end changes. And that's how you can remember extracting, and then for inlining it is just N. Now let's extract parameter of this message, and then it's gonna ask us whether we want to introduce it as a parameter on the function or on the class itself. I'm gonna select the function in this case, and then it's gonna ask me how do I want to name this and whether I want to introduce a default value or not. So you can play with this as much as you want. Now, because I have message in both cases, I can just inline this message and everything's gonna work as it was before. Now let's undo this for a moment. Because I put the cursor on a message or selected the message, it extracted only that value. But if I put the cursor on the message variable and then hit the refactoring, it is going to directly extract the message as a parameter. Once again, we have a chance to rename it if we want to, or just hit enter to keep the message. And by default, it replaces all three occurrences, which in this case is just gonna remain as it was before. So as you can see, these kind of refactorings are super handy, and they're gonna save you a lot of time in a little bit bigger code base when you have to replace or extract or inline multiple things in the same refactoring session. You may notice that the hard-coded message value that we had here was automatically moved on the call side of this process message function. Now, another refactoring technique that I want to show you is when introducing something new or when you are replacing old code with a new code. My approach is always to introduce something new, then change the calls from the old thing to the new thing, and then remove the old thing. So let's see that in action. Assume that this private fun log is a function and we want to wrap that into a class so that we can reuse it all over the place. The way I am approaching this is always create a class first, and I'm gonna name this logger. And then inside this class, I'm going to copy the function without a private modifier and then paste it inside. At this point, nothing has changed because this logger class and the function inside are not used. Now on the call side, I want to replace the call from the old thing to use the new thing. And in this case, I'm just gonna create new logger and call the log function. Pay attention that in this case, we have introduced a logical duplication because every time we call the process messages, it is going to create new logger. And we are going to address that just in a bit. For now, getting back to the logging, we notice that the old log function is no longer used, so I can simply remove it. Now let's repeat the same thing for the processing. I'm going to introduce here a new class and I'll name it message processor. Next, I'm going to copy the process function, again without the private modifier, and I'm going to paste it inside a message processor. While here, instead of calling print line, I'm gonna call the logger log instead. At this point, nothing changes because the message processor is still not being used. And again, to repeat the process, the first step is introduce something new. The second is replace the calls from the old thing to the new thing, and then remove the old thing. So essentially, by now we have completed the first step, introducing something new. The second would be replacing the calls. So going back to my process messages function, I'm going to replace the process call to use the message processor. Once again, I'm introducing a logical duplication, and that's something we're gonna deal with just in a moment. With this call, I have completed the second step, which is changing the call from the old thing to the new thing. The last thing is to remove the old thing, which now becomes unused. So I can use Android Studio to delete that, or I can delete it manually. Now, what we ended up with is class logger and class message processor that are having the functions inside. A problem that we have introduced meanwhile was this logical duplication that we have introduced on the way. The next thing I want to do is I want to inline the process messages function, so then these two lines are going to be inlined in the check inside the test. So let's do that refactoring, and I'm going to remove the function. And finally, let's address the logical duplication problem. To do so, once again, we can extract parameters. So let's start with this logger here. We are gonna do refactor and then introduce parameter or command option P. And then it's going to ask us where do we want to introduce it, whether in the function or the class. I'm going to choose the class in this case, and then I'm not going to introduce a default value. I'll keep the name logger and just hitting enter once again, I did that refactoring. So what I've done effectively is I have removed the logical duplication because the logger now is coming as a constructor parameter on the message processor. So when constructing the message processor, we are going to pass a logger that we are going to reuse inside. To bring this a step further, I can also mark this as private. Back to the test, I'm instantiating logger 2 times and there is no need for that. So I can extract local variable for this. And when it asks me whether I want to replace both occurrences, I'm gonna choose both. I'll keep the name logger. Furthermore, I can also extract the message processor. So if I just make a selection of the thing that I want to extract and then hit the keyword shortcut for introducing local variable, it is going to extract that straight away, allowing me to change its name if I wanted to. Then I'm gonna move the line above and split the lines. Now we're having the code nicer. Ultimately, I'm gonna go ahead and extract the message as a class property. And to do so, I'm gonna use property here, and it's gonna ask me whether I want to extract that inside a class or in the file itself. In this case, I'm gonna use the class. It allows me to change its name. In this case, I'm gonna use message. And once again, it allows me to replace all the occurrences if I wanted to, which is something that I'm gonna do. So to summarize, the refactorings that you're gonna use the most are rename, extract, and inline. And by mastering these 3 refactorings, you are gonna boost your productivity significantly. And always remember, whenever you are refactoring, first introduce something new, replace the calls from the old to the new thing, and then remove the old thing. So those are the 3 steps that you need to follow all the time when refactoring, and that's going to be the safest way for you to refactor. And always remember, between all of these 3 steps, make sure the tests are passing. See you in the next one.